Out of 700 tunnel rats who crawled into vietcong tunnels during the Vietnam War, over 400 never came back up alive. They had a life expectancy of just 3 weeks underground, but here's what most people don't know. These weren't elite special forces or trained commandos. They were just regular soldiers who happened to be small enough to fit through a hole in the ground. Once you went down, there was no radio contact, no backup, and no way out except through the same tunnel where the enemy was waiting for you. Today, we're going to show you why tunnel rats had one of the most terrifying jobs in military history, how the Viet Cong turned underground warfare into a nightmare that Hollywood could never capture, and the psychological horror that haunted the survivors for decades. We have one particular story at the end that shows just how dark things got when the normal rules of war simply didn't apply 30 feet underground. By 1965, American forces in South Vietnam were facing an enemy unlike anything they'd encountered before. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army had spent decades building an underground network that stretched for over 150 miles beneath the countryside around Saigon. These weren't simple foxholes or bunkers that you see in World War II footage. The Cu Chi tunnels were a complete underground city, 3 levels deep, with hospitals, ammunition factories, sleeping quarters, command centers, and kitchens, all connected by narrow passages barely wide enough for a human body. The tunnels were specifically engineered for the smaller Vietnamese fighters, with some passages so narrow you had to crawl on your belly for hundreds of yards. This underground network allowed the Viet Cong to appear and disappear like ghosts, launching surprise attacks and then vanishing before American forces could respond. Artillery couldn't reach them. Bombing runs were useless against targets 30 feet underground. Airstrikes just rearranged the dirt on top. The US military had no doctrine for this kind of warfare. No training program existed. No specialized equipment had been developed. They realized that the only way to clear these tunnels was to send someone down into the darkness, and that someone had to be small enough to fit through spaces designed for fighters who averaged 5'4" and 110 pounds. So they started looking for the smallest soldiers they could find and sending them into hell with nothing but a pistol and a prayer. Tunnel rats weren't volunteers. They were what the military called voluntold. Officers would line up their troops and pick out anyone under 5'6" and less than 130 pounds. Suddenly, being short went from a minor inconvenience to a potential death sentence. Most tunnel rats were 18 or 19 years old, fresh out of basic training from places like Iowa and Texas, with no idea they'd end up crawling through underground death mazes in Southeast Asia. Their equipment was laughably inadequate for what they were being asked to do. The standard kit consisted of a .45 caliber pistol, chosen not for its stopping power, but because its large, slow bullet wouldn't ricochet as much in confined spaces. They carried a military flashlight that gave them maybe 10 feet of visibility, a combat knife, and sometimes a length of rope if they were lucky. That was it. No grenades, too dangerous in confined spaces. No rifle, too long and cumbersome. They stripped down to just pants and a t-shirt to avoid getting caught on obstacles or debris. Training for this deadly job consisted of maybe a day or two crawling through mock tunnels constructed back at base. But nothing could prepare them for the real thing. Tunnels filled with booby traps, poisonous snakes deliberately placed by the Viet Cong, chambers flooded with water or filled with toxic gas from decomposing bodies. The training tunnels were clean, well lit, and safe. The real tunnels were designed by an enemy who had perfected underground warfare over decades of fighting the French and then the Americans. A tunnel rat worked with a small support team above ground, someone to manage the rope if they used one, a medic standing by in case they came up wounded, and riflemen to watch for other tunnel entrances. But once you dropped 20 feet underground and started crawling through those passages, that support team might as well have been on another planet. No radio worked through 30 feet of Earth. No one could hear you scream. Picture this. You're 18 years old from a farm in Ohio. 6 months ago, your biggest worry was passing your senior year of high school. Now you're lowering yourself into a hole in the Vietnamese jungle, not knowing if it leads to an empty tunnel or a room full of enemy soldiers waiting to cut your throat. The entrance is so small, you have to exhale just to fit your shoulders through. As you drop down, the tropical heat above ground gives way to cool, stale air that tastes of earth and death. The tunnels were built in a deliberate maze pattern to confuse and trap intruders. You'd crawl through a passage for 50 yards, following the weak beam of your flashlight, only to hit a dead end or find a chamber flooded waist-deep with stagnant water. The air was thick and humid, sometimes toxic from decomposing bodies or gas deliberately released by the vietcong. Your flashlight beam could only penetrate a few feet ahead through the murky darkness, and every shadow could hide a booby trap or an enemy fighter. The Vietcong had perfected tunnel warfare through decades of experience. They rigged doorways with grenades that would explode if you opened them the wrong way. They placed punji stakes, sharpened bamboo spears dipped in human waste, in narrow passages where you couldn't see them until you were crawling directly into them. Some tunnels had false floors that would drop you into spike-filled pits. Others had chambers designed to flood, drowning anyone trapped inside. But the absolute worst moment was when you turned a corner in that coffin narrow space and found yourself face to face with a Vietcong fighter. There was no room to maneuver, no cover to dive behind, no space to even fully extend your arm to aim. It came down to who could draw and fire first in pitch-black darkness, with both fighters so close they could smell each other's sweat. These encounters lasted seconds, but tunnel rats said they felt like hours, the longest, most terrifying hours of their lives. The Vietcong quickly learned to target tunnel rats specifically. They would leave false intelligence, discarded documents or abandoned equipment to lure Americans deeper into the tunnel systems. Then they'd trigger explosives to collapse sections, trapping them underground to die slowly in the darkness. Some tunnel complexes had specialized chambers designed to flood when triggered, drowning anyone inside who couldn't find the exit in time. Even if you survived the enemy, the tunnels themselves were trying to kill you. Tunnel rats developed what medics called tunnel sickness, a combination of claustrophobia, oxygen deprivation, and complete psychological breakdown. Many would come up vomiting, disoriented, unable to remember where they'd been or what they'd seen down there. Some would freeze up completely while crawling through the passages, unable to move forward or backward, and have to be pulled out by their ankles while having a complete panic attack. The darkness did something to your mind that was hard to explain to anyone who hadn't been down there. Tunnel rats reported hallucinations, hearing voices of dead comrades, complete sensory distortion where they couldn't tell up from down. Some described feeling like the tunnel walls were closing in, even in passages they'd crawled through before. The psychological pressure was so intense that many tunnel rats would volunteer for the most dangerous above-ground missions just to avoid going back underground. But perhaps the most devastating aspect wasn't the physical danger, it was the moral complexity of what they found down there. The tunnels weren't just military installations. They were complete underground communities where enemy families had been living for years. Tunnel rats would discover hospitals with wounded Vietcong fighters who couldn't move, supply caches mixed with children's toys, even nurseries where families raised their children 30 feet underground. They were given orders to destroy everything they found, but that often meant killing people who couldn't fight back, including civilians who had never held a weapon. One tunnel rat, Sergeant Arnold Gutierrez, described finding a vietcong command bunker 30 feet underground. As he crawled toward it through a passage barely wider than his shoulders, he could hear voices inside, people talking, laughing, completely unaware that an American soldier was just yards away. He had a choice: throw a grenade into the room and complete his mission, or back out through hundreds of yards of tunnel and let them escape. He chose the grenade. When he crawled into the room afterward to search for intelligence, he found 3 enemy soldiers and a woman holding a baby, all dead. He never got over what he'd done down there. None of them did. The statistics tell the brutal story. In some units, tunnel rat casualties reached 90%. The average tunnel rat lasted 3 weeks before being killed, wounded, or suffering a complete psychological breakdown. Many of those who survived longer than a month would request immediate transfer to regular infantry, anything to avoid going back underground. They said they'd rather face machine guns and mortars in the open jungle than spend another minute in those tunnels. As the war progressed and the casualties mounted, the military finally started taking tunnel warfare seriously. They developed specialized equipment that should have existed from the beginning: primitive night vision scopes, gas masks for chemical threats, better communication gear that could work through some earth barriers. Some tunnel rats started carrying 38 caliber revolvers instead of 45 caliber pistols because they were lighter and easier to handle in the impossibly tight spaces. The military also began using different tactics to avoid sending men into the tunnels altogether. They would pump CS gas into tunnel systems, then seal all the entrances they could find. Others used tunnel destruction, setting off massive explosives to collapse entire sections of the network. These methods meant giving up valuable intelligence that could only be gathered by physically searching the tunnels. But commanders decided that some information wasn't worth the human cost. Recognition of the psychological toll led to mandatory rotation policies. No soldier could serve as a tunnel rat for more than a few months at a time. Some bases instituted informal counseling sessions where tunnel rats could talk to others who had been through the same underground hell. It wasn't much, but it was better than the complete isolation they'd faced earlier. But the Viet Cong adapted too. They started building even more complex tunnel systems with multiple false entrances, better camouflaged booby traps, and specialized tunnel fighters trained specifically to kill American tunnel rats. The underground war became a deadly game of chess, played in total darkness, with each side constantly adapting to counter the other's latest tactics. By the end of the Vietnam War, tunnel rats had cleared thousands of tunnels, captured tons of weapons and supplies, and saved countless American lives by neutralizing threats that conventional forces couldn't reach. But they paid a price that's impossible to calculate, not just in the 400 who never came back up, but in the psychological damage that lasted for decades after the war ended. Many tunnel rat veterans suffered from severe PTSD that was complicated by the fact that most people had never heard of their job. While other Vietnam veterans could find others who understood their experiences, tunnel rats had fought a war that happened in complete darkness, in spaces most people couldn't even imagine. They'd made moral choices in situations where the normal rules of combat simply didn't apply. The tunnel rat experience fundamentally changed how the US military approaches unconventional warfare. Modern special operations units study Vietnam tunnel tactics, and the psychological lessons learned from these young soldiers influenced how the military handles confined space operations and urban warfare today. The techniques developed for supporting tunnel rats became the foundation for modern combat stress control programs. But perhaps the most important legacy is the recognition that sometimes the most crucial battles are fought by soldiers whose names never make it into history books. Young men who crawled into hell because someone had to, armed with nothing but a pistol and the knowledge that their fellow soldiers were counting on them to come back up with intelligence that might save lives. The tunnel rats of Vietnam proved that courage isn't about having the best equipment or the most training. Sometimes it's just about being an 18-year-old kid from Ohio who's willing to crawl into the darkness because that's what the mission requires, even when you know the odds of coming back alive are barely 50-50. If you found this story worth remembering, help us honor more forgotten veterans by subscribing. There are thousands of stories like this that deserve to be told. Stories of ordinary soldiers who did extraordinary things in the worst possible circumstances.